We need to talk about Achraf Hakimi and his wife. Now there's a sentence that I never thought I'd say on this channel, but I'm afraid it's true, and it's quite important for a couple of reasons. Any of you with access to the internet, which I would imagine is all of you, otherwise I'm not quite sure how you're watching this, and particularly any of you who use social media, will most likely have seen a story about PSG right-back Achraf Hakimi in recent days. If not, then you have lived a charmed and enchanted life up to this point, and you should turn this video off now if you don't want me to ruin it. Alrighty then, but don't say that you weren't warned. Throughout last week, there was an extremely viral news story claiming, with almost the exact same wording from thousands of different accounts, that Achraf Hakimi's wife wanted more than half of the Moroccan footballer's property and fortune in their divorce, that he earns more than €1 million a month at PSG, so she thought that she had hit the jackpot. Again, none of this is my wording, just so that we're clear, but that when the separated couple arrived in court, she discovered that he had no property or assets because he had put his entire fortune in his mother's name a long time ago. I first saw this claim from an account called Purely Football, which has over 600,000 followers on Twitter, and I thought that it sounded like it was probably complete nonsense, but I also don't really care about Achraf Hakimi's divorce settlement, so I thought nothing of it and moved on. Sure, the framing and language seemed to be inherently misogynistic, portraying Hakimi's wife as being scheming and greedy, and Hakimi as being smart and tactful, which is particularly odd given that the couple's divorce comes in the almost immediate aftermath of Hakimi having been indicted by a French court on rape charges. But hey, a misogynistic post celebrating an accused rapist from a football Twitter account is hardly like seeing a critically endangered Sumatran rhino in the wild. No, I'm afraid it's much more like finding an ant on a lollipop which you have just dropped on an ant colony in the world's largest ant farm. Get too annoyed about it, and you'll likely find yourself stuck in an eternal screaming vortex of outrage, where your only sanctity comes courtesy of the woke paradise and unproblematic utopia that is the HITC Sevens Twitter feed, pumping out blisteringly benign hot takes as though they were going out of fashion. Because, you know, they actually are. But later on that day, I saw the same tweet from another account, this time with over 50,000 likes, and then another one that had over 100,000 likes, and I noticed that Hakimi was trending number 1 in my What's Happening tab, at which point I made the fatal mistake of clicking on his name to see what people were saying. As soon as I did that, I was flooded with an avalanche of raw sewage, much like going swimming in any of Britain's rivers or seas, but unlike the literal excrement that the Tories have allowed to engulf the UK's waterways, this was a festering swamp of metaphorical turds that greeted me on a website that has welcomed back neo-Nazis since being acquired by the world's second richest divorcee, and as I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled, wading through more human waste than the true Geordie does when he's having a wet dream, it dawned upon me that I was going to have to take radical action in an attempt to redress the balance and sanitize the discourse, like some kind of one-man sewage treatment plant. That's right, I was going to have to do a tweet. Before I tweeted, because I am an extremely diligent journalist, I naturally tried to figure out where the story had come from and whether there was any truth to it. I discovered that there was no legitimate source for it, and by that I mean no court documents, no primary sources, and no remotely respectable newspapers, news outlets, or websites that had reported on it, and therefore there was zero basis upon which to believe that it was even true, but more on that in a moment. The largest English language news outlet reporting what was, therefore, a totally baseless story as apparent fact at that stage, you will be shocked to discover, was the Barstool football account, a subsidiary of Barstool Sports, a company which was, until recently, owned and still employs this man, David Portnoy, who recently went viral on Twitter for stating whilst on holiday in Italy that, in Europe, quote, they don't do lunch, and coffee doesn't exist. Portnoy, incidentally, has also faced multiple accusations of sexual assault and harassment, which he denies. never particularly concerned with minor details like the truth, evidence, or basic human decency, Barstool tweeted this, a screenshot from an Instagram account called Stad's Football Club with a photo of Hakimi and his wife, captioned, Achraf Hakimi's wife had taken the court for a divorce case and wanted them to separate the assets and divide them in court. When the divorce took place and they agreed to share the assets, they realised Achraf Hakimi had no assets, and neither did the bank. Achraf Hakimi had put all his fortune in his mother's name a long time ago, grinning face with sweat emoji. Plus a photograph of Hakimi with his mother at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, and the lads at Barstool captioned the two images, Hakimi is playing 4D chess, shocked face with exploding head emoji. Hey, who needs evidence when you've got such sweet, sweet expressive emojis? So I quote tweeted Barstool Football as one of many, but at that stage, the biggest organisation covering the story, with a very transparent slant, and I wrote, this story is being shared everywhere despite the fact there is no evidence to support it. It is very obviously not true, and would be illegal even if it were true, brackets, which it obviously isn't. Very strange way to cover a story about someone who has been indicted on rape charges. End of my tweet. Now, that tweet was motoring on nicely, with several hundred retweets and thousands of likes within about half an hour, and was well on its way to ratioing the fun-loving social media dudes at Barstool Football, until they decided to block me, which meant that the tweet appeared like this to everyone instead, thus kind of killing it dead. Or at least, I assume that's why they blocked me. It was either that or because last month I called them the worst account on football Twitter and described every take of theirs that has ever found its way onto my timeline as being 100% undiluted horsepiss. It can be hard to tell, but a life lesson either way there to screenshot instead of quote tweeting, and if you take absolutely nothing else away from this video, then let it be that. Again though, in normal circumstances, I'd leave it at that. I've made my radical act of tweeting about it. That is at least 38 seconds of my life that I'll never get back. The lads at Barstool have bottled it and blocked me. Now there is a blessing in disguise, if ever there was one. My pipette of reason has been drowned out by a waterfall of nonsense, as by this stage, there were several identikit Hakimi and his wife tweets, with 100,000 plus likes, but wasn't it always thus? But then I took a look at some of the quote tweets and replies to my tweet. Big mistake. Allow me to share a few of them with you, though be prepared that just being confronted with some of these may cost you between 20 to 25 IQ points. A reminder, for what it's worth, that this was my tweet. Mac of Nations replied, Hakimi hasn't been convicted yet, and she's already carrying out her evil plans, which means she had conceived it a long time ago. Her evil plans that he is referring to there being to get a divorce. As I pointed out to Big Mac, you are allowed to leave your accused rapist husband, even if they haven't been convicted. In fact, and this is going to come as big of a shock to you as it did to him, you are actually allowed to leave your husband, even if they haven't been accused of raping anyone in the first place. Max said, her timing to carry out the divorce is centered around his case in court. Hakimi and his wife had actually separated before the alleged sexual assault occurred, so there is every indication that they were already planning to get divorced, but even if they weren't, if your spouse is accused of sexually assaulting someone, and you believe the alleged victim, as Hakimi's wife has hinted that indeed she does, is that not quite a legitimate reason to accelerate divorce proceedings? In fact, of all of the reasons to do so, I'd have thought that would be quite high up there. There is a character limit on Twitter though, so I just replied instead saying, you're mental, which, admittedly, with the benefit of hindsight, was much too generous. Mac replied saying, my views are just controversial to you, which, is true in fairness, but as I pointed out, not just to me, but also to anyone else who has a functioning cerebral cortex. Sadly, that was the end of my friendship with Mac, who went off merrily arguing with someone else that women were created for comfort, and men to till the earth, which is the kind of nonsense that you might expect to be daubed in bodily fluids on the walls of a toilet in a 17th century lunatic asylum. But fear not, because there is someone with a picture of the Pope in a puffer jacket and a dinosaur emoji in their username who picked up Max Batten and ran with it. Standing on the shoulders of giants, truly, RT wrote, "Why does she want the alleged rapist's money?" This was kind of a common theme, not just in my mentions, but all over the internet. Thousands of comments by 14-year-old boys whose TikTok algorithms have thrown so many Andrew Tate videos at them that their brains have begun to melt before they have even had the opportunity to form, arguing variously, and often simultaneously, that all women are evil, women are property, women should never get anything in a divorce, presumably even in the substantial minority of growing incidents in which they earn more than their spouse, and that Hakimi's wife, who I really should name at this stage, she is called Hiba Abouk, had only ever married him to get a divorce and to shake him down in the first place. This isn't really about Abouk, since at least 9 out of 10 comments were just raging incel rhetoric about all women, and I know absolutely nothing about her or her intentions. For all I know, maybe she did marry Achraf Hakimi because, age 19 or 20, she could already see that he was destined for stardom, even if it would take a couple of years on loan at Borussia Dortmund, which preceded Hakimi's move to Inter Milan and eventually PSG, for that potential to be realised. It's not impossible, and it's not as though it has never happened before. I would speculate that it is fairly unlikely, simply because Abouk was already independently very wealthy before marrying Hakimi, as a successful actress in Spain who played a leading role in a drama series called El Príncipe. I've never seen it myself, but apparently it was quite big. Abouk also has 1.7 million followers on Instagram and has brand deals with the likes of Louis Vuitton, Bulgari, and Dior. In short then, she will be independently wealthier than 99.9% of people watching this video and who interacted with my tweet. I'm sure Hakimi still earns more money than her, but it's certainly not as though she is, or indeed was, some kind of penniless woman desperately in need of a footballer husband, as some would seemingly have you believe. Ignoring all of that though, even if we assume Abouk is a terrible human being, and I don't believe there is any evidence to suggest that that is the case, that would have precisely zero bearing on any woman other than her. Secondly, and I really cannot stress this enough, I beg that these people would do some research on marriage. There are different cultural norms, rights, and legal obligations that accompany marriage in different jurisdictions, with various caveats and clauses that are far too complicated to get into in any meaningful way in this video, but a common obligation, certainly in France, Italy, Germany, and Spain, the last 4 countries where Hakimi and Abouk have lived, in the union of 2 people is a certain union of finances, to the extent that when you get married, as a general rule, your money ceases to be your money anymore and becomes our money instead. When people ask why a man or woman, and invariably it is a woman that they ask this about, has any right to their husband's wealth, they are often overlooking the fact that it isn't technically the husband's wealth at all, it is their wealth, and now that they are separating, it is to be divided either as their prenuptial, or, failing that, in a contested divorce, a court sees fit. It's not exactly a new concept, and, in many instances, it is hardly unreasonable. If my girlfriend and I earn the same salary, but we decide to get married and have a kid or kids, that is, not happening, just let me tell you, but embellish me nonetheless, and she quits her job or takes on reduced hours to take on childcare responsibilities, whilst I keep working as though we weren't now sharing a house with a screaming, vomiting, living human being, and maintain the same salary or increased it with career progression, and then we decided to divorce, it makes sense to me at least that while she made pretty severe career sacrifices for a kid that we had together, and I didn't, that she should be entitled to some of the money that I earned, given that she is now earning far less, or indeed nothing at all, precisely because of that fact, and has probably just set her own career development back multiple years, if indeed she did return to the workforce and to the same profession. This feels like a major digression, but so many people seem unable to grasp that basic point, which seems fairly reasonable and straightforward to me at least, that it felt worth pointing out. But anyway, even if you look at that example that I've just given and think, no, that is outrageous, women are evil and shouldn't get anything, you should get to keep all of your ad revenue, Alfie, let your fictional divorced wife rot. Well, that would be, awfully aggressive of you, I suppose. I might have been at fault, but even if you believe all of that, it's not as though it's any great secret how marriage tends to work, so if you didn't want to enter into a legally binding union with a great big set of rules, including financial rules, for when you want to get out, you probably shouldn't have got married in the first place. Then there were tweets contesting whether it would be possible to avoid paying a divorce settlement by giving all of your money to your mum. And there were so many of them, each more ill-informed yet stated with even more gusto and confidence than the last, like some kind of digital art installation attempting to illustrate the Dunning-Kruger effect that was a little bit too on the nose. I am not a lawyer, you will be quite surprised to discover, I imagine, let alone a French lawyer, or better still, a French lawyer specialising in family law, so I don't claim to be an expert. Nor, in fact, has it even been established where Hakimi and Abouk were married, and will likely be divorcing. However, in the UK, and certainly in most of the Western world, which I think we can assume is where they will be divorced, you can't just transfer all of your assets either throughout a marriage or right before getting divorced over to someone else without your spouse's consent, and then claim when divorce proceedings begin that you're actually penniless, live in a shoebox, and that your mum still gives you an allowance for sweeties, match attacks, and stink bombs. I assume that is still what people are spending their pocket money on. It's not as though this is something that has never been tried, though it has been rendered reasonably rare due to the degree to which it has proved to be futile, and on many occasions actively damaging to the guilty party, and potentially even illegal. In a contested divorce, a court will attempt to establish the assets and liabilities of both parties, and can go to varying lengths in different countries in order to obtain that information. If one party has given all of their assets to their mum, including, I should say, according to a lot of the unsubstantiated tweets about Hakimi, between 80% of his PSG salary to the entirety of it paid to her directly, a court is going to pull that up, tell them not to be so daft, and consider those assets still to be theirs. If that wasn't the case, either one or both parties would give all of their money to someone else in almost every contested divorce. Not only that, even if one were successful in somehow duping their spouse or former spouse by hiding the true value of their assets, if that was found to be the case at literally any stage in the future, the former husband or wife could challenge the settlement, have it brought back into court, the original settlement overturned, and new divorce proceedings begin. And I know for a fact that that is the case in France because there is a rather famous case in which exactly that happened. So even supposing the entirely unsubstantiated story about Hakimi, his wife, and his mother were true, and that it somehow fooled some court somewhere, the only way he would likely get away with it is if he never got any of that money or assets back from his mum, in which case, I mean, it's kind of an odd W, isn't it? There was all manner of financially illiterate mental gymnastics from people in my mentions, trying to create a way in which Hakimi could legitimately have given his mother all of his money without a court finding it to be fraudulent, from setting up charities and trusts, to him only having given his mum all of his money from before he got married, which, given that he is 24 years old, he got married in 2020, and he has earned the vast majority of his wealth since 2020, would appear to undermine the entire point of what is still most likely an entirely fictitious plot to defraud his wife. Those responses were overwhelmingly coherent and well-adjusted, though, compared to the people who challenged whether the story was true at all, rather than simply whether it was feasible in the abstract. Oh, yes, no, it was here that the real brainworm set in. Tariq was insistent that, without knowing either Hakimi or Abouk personally, one couldn't possibly comment on whether it was a bit weird that a story about Achraf Hakimi was the #1 trend on Twitter with zero actual evidence of any of it being true. My analogy that, without knowing Steve Sidwell personally, that I would dismiss claims that he had been to Mars if they were presented without any evidence, did little to dissuade Tariq from his belief that extraordinary claims made without any evidence cannot simply be dismissed unless the person dismissing them can produce evidence that it isn't the case. It's at this point that it is probably best just to log off, or, if you've got a medium-sized YouTube channel, just make a video about it. Except, this video isn't about Tariq, the bloody lovable rogue, as much affection as I have for him. It is about two things. Firstly, digital literacy, the ability to disseminate information, and the enduring stupidity of mankind to believe anything and everything that they read on the internet with no questions asked or even the faintest hint of curiosity. And secondly, this sort of weirdo incel nerd culture and rampant misogyny among young football fans, and indeed non-football fans, which is rotting a lot of people's brains and is not likely, much as some red-pilled edgelords on the internet may tell them otherwise, to lead to happy and fulfilling relationships with the opposite sex, or even to help them get laid. The first is probably impossible to fix, though I do think that younger people ought to be a bit better at it. Just as 15-year-olds are a lot better at spotting a scam email than their parents or certainly their grandparents, I'd like to think that they could be better at spotting nonsense unsubstantiated news stories that are light on facts and heavy on engendering reactionary views and moral panics. The boomers are a lost cause at this stage. A combination of Facebook and the Murdoch empire has already convinced them that transgender youths caused the 2008 global financial crisis, and refugees are telling everyone that they didn't fight in World War II despite acting like they did, but young people still have the potential to see through all of that. Following a little bit of digging, I discovered that the original source, or at least the earliest that I could find, namely that screenshot from Stad's Football Club, is basically just a Senegalese football Instagram page and YouTube channel who tweet quite regularly about Hakimi, though normally just vaguely celebratory things about him, rather than claiming to have any first-hand knowledge of how his divorce proceedings are getting on. The first large verified account to share the story on social media, again, as far as I can tell, and not that having a blue tick actually means anything necessarily these days, was First Maglavrai, another exclusively online and exclusively social media-based account whose biggest claim to fame is being the #1 TikTok account for the people of the Ivory Coast. I'm not saying that it's not good, I'm sure their TikToks are brilliant, but it is hardly the Associated Press or Reuters. Since then, the story has been covered by a whole host of disreputable African and West Asian news outlets, and I'm not saying that they are disreputable because they're African or West Asian, just so that we are absolutely clear. I am saying that, much like the Daily Express or the Daily Star in the UK, they are disreputable even by local or regional standards. The largest perhaps being Al Arabiya, a Riyadh-based news channel which is 60% owned by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and has repeatedly been mired in controversy and scandal due to plagiarism, fake reporting, and accusations of being a mouthpiece for the brutal Saudi regime. Marca, the Spanish newspaper, has made a couple of SEO-targeted articles covering the claims about Hakimi and his divorce, attempting to hoover up clicks, as have The Sun in England, who published an online article about Andrew Tate calling Hakimi a top G. Even The Sun, when reporting on Tate's comment on the story, used the words unconfirmed reports and unsubstantiated rumours to describe Hakimi's alleged financial situation and claims about his divorce. For anyone who is unfamiliar with The Sun, you must live a charmed life, but they are not exactly renowned for their due diligence or for their reluctance to report total fiction as being supposed fact. The Sun lost £127.2 million last year, in large part due to legal fees subsidised by Fox News, another of Rupert Murdoch's famously diligent and accurate propaganda outlets, but in that case, one that is actually profitable. It takes about 5 seconds to type the name of someone or something into Google using the News tab to see if it has been covered by any organisation that you should begin to trust, even if that trust is for reasons only of them not wanting to get sued. Or, even just a search for it on Twitter to see if any accounts that you know to be reliable have mentioned it, or whether it is all absolute drivel from the likes of Daily Loud, Purely Football, and a variety of accounts aimed at advertising gambling to teenagers. That leads nicely to the second point, since young people, broadly speaking, are more progressive and therefore less misogynistic, and when I say young people, I mean younger people, i.e. 50-year-olds tend to be less misogynistic than 70-year-olds, 30-year-olds less so than 50-year-olds, and so on and so forth. And I think that is partly because they are better at disseminating, particularly online information. However, within that broader context, there is a fairly inevitable reactionary backlash among a large minority of predominantly young men, driven by a whole host of factors that would require an entire video of their own, and probably ought to be uploaded to a separate channel, as it would be even less relevant to football than this one. These people exist, though, in reasonably large numbers, and it is perhaps unsurprising that they are extremely online. Their palpable delight at the totally unsourced and unsubstantiated claims about Hakimi and his divorce from his wife are rooted in the fantasy of getting one over a woman, which, again, is particularly sinister in this instance, given that the young man that they are hero-worshipping has been indicted on serious rape charges. But again, as far as they're concerned, and this isn't just my pop psychology, I am literally quoting many of the tweets that I read, sexual assault doesn't really exist. It's just another way for women to make money out of men through false accusations, or even worse, that if the allegations were true or are true, the women in question deserved it, or are somehow to blame. A lot of people making these kinds of arguments, and I would say a majority of them in fact, are about 14 or 15 years old. And I think the likelihood is that, as distasteful as they may be, they will just grow out of it. I believed a lot of wacky and dumb things at that age, but look at me now. That's right, wise and perfect in all ways. Some of them won't though, or at least not without a helping hand, so it is worth pushing back against some of this stuff. And as someone with a decent-sized audience, which is about 95% male and a third of which are under the age of 24, it seemed worth taking this opportunity to do just that. I lost count of the amount of tweets that I read, celebrating Hakimi's almost certainly fictitious, or at best, greatly misleading financial arrangements as being a victory for all men. Now, I am a man, have been for a while now, and even if we suppose that the story were wholly accurate, which is literally impossible in some parts, but just go along with it, I just don't feel like I have gained much out of a multi-millionaire footballer who has been indicted on rape charges, having successfully hidden his assets in his mum's name, his mother being a woman too there, of course, so that he doesn't have to give his also multi-millionaire wife any money as part of their divorce settlement. I don't feel like that's benefited me at all, to be honest. A huge win for men would be shared paternity leave, the Champions League becoming free to air again on ITV, and never having to hear Peter Walton's view on a refereeing decision ever again. I'm sorry, Peter, but we could replace you with AI that is just programmed to agree with whatever the referee and VAR decides to do in about 15 seconds. Anyway, I will leave it there because this video is already twice as long as I had intended, probably because I spent the first 3 minutes talking about turds. Thank you all very much, as you could argue that the whole thing was about turds in a certain sense, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Leave death threats in the comments if you didn't. No, don't really. I mean, inevitably someone will, but let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure, of course, it goes without saying, that you are subscribed both to this channel and my backup channel, both of which should be on your screens now, and have notifications turned on. And you could also follow me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so. And why wouldn't you, after just being given a glimpse of my incredible tweeting?